My name is Claire, and I'm 29 years old. I've spent the last 5 years as a graphic designer at one of the most well-known advertising agencies in the city. It's the kind of place people dream of working at: glamorous, high-paying, and full of talented creatives. But there's one thing they don't tell you when you walk through those shiny doors: how easy it is to get lost in the shuffle, how quickly the credit can be taken from you, how easily you can be overlooked, and how no one really notices until the damage is done. For years, I let them take my ideas, take my work, and pretend it was theirs. But there's a limit to what you can take. And when they took credit for something that was mine, something I had poured my soul into, I made sure they lost everything. Because if they thought they could take what I created, they would learn that I was the one who had the power all along. It was supposed to be my dream job. For years, I had imagined myself working at Carver & Hill, one of the most prestigious advertising agencies in the city. The office was sleek, the clients were top tier, and the creative work was revolutionary. It was the kind of place people in the industry talked about with awe. But nothing prepares you for the reality of a place like this, a place where the lines between success and manipulation are blurred, and where talent can easily be stolen if you aren't careful. I had worked hard to get here. After graduating from a lesser-known art school, I spent years building my portfolio, taking freelance jobs, and gaining experience wherever I could. It wasn't easy, and the road was long. But eventually, it paid off. My designs began to get noticed, my name started circulating in the right circles, and when the opportunity came to join Carver & Hill, I jumped at it. I was proud, eager, and ready to show the world what I could do. Little did I know, I was walking into a nightmare. At first, things were as I expected: fast-paced, exciting, and full of opportunity. The work was challenging but rewarding. I was trusted with high-profile clients, given creative freedom to develop campaigns that pushed boundaries. For the first few months, I felt like I was finally where I belonged. I was making a difference, and I was good at what I did. The team I worked with, especially Jeremy and Sarah, were experienced and supportive, or so I thought. Jeremy was the creative director, confident, charming, and quick to give a compliment when deserved. Sarah was the account manager, sharp, resourceful, and always moving a mile a minute. Together, they made a great team, and I often found myself admiring their ability to juggle clients, deadlines, and office politics. I thought we were in sync, a solid unit moving toward shared success. But that wasn't the whole story. It started slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. I'd worked on several major campaigns with Jeremy and Sarah. I put in the hours, the brainstorming, the late nights, the endless revisions. The work I was doing felt like my own. My designs were shaping the campaigns, my concepts were being refined and polished. But somewhere along the line, I noticed a shift. One afternoon, I was sitting in a meeting with Sarah, Jeremy, and the rest of the team. We were presenting a new concept for a luxury brand campaign we had been working on for weeks. It was my idea, my design, my vision. I had worked tirelessly to create something innovative, something that would capture the essence of the brand while pushing the boundaries of conventional advertising. When the meeting started, I was confident. I knew this was my moment. I was ready to shine. As we began presenting the concept, I sat quietly, waiting for Jeremy to turn to me and give me the floor. But instead, he started talking over me, explaining parts of the design that I had conceptualized, adding his own flair to my work. At first, I thought it was a simple misunderstanding. Maybe he just wanted to take the lead and guide the client through the presentation. But as the minutes ticked by, it became clear that he wasn't just guiding the conversation, he was taking credit for my ideas. Sarah joined in, repeating his points as if they were both responsible for everything. I sat there in silence, watching them speak, feeling my stomach twist. They were presenting my work as their own. Every word that left their mouths, every explanation they gave about my design, felt like a knife in my chest. The client was nodding along, impressed, unaware that the creative genius behind the campaign wasn't sitting at the table anymore. I was invisible. My name had been erased, and they were reaping the rewards of my hard work. When the meeting ended, the client was happy. The campaign had been approved, but I couldn't bring myself to feel proud. Instead, I felt hollow, angry, and betrayed. I had just helped land a massive account for the agency, and no one even knew it was my idea. Jeremy and Sarah congratulated me on the approval, but it was clear their praise was more of a formality. They were already looking ahead, already focused on their next project, and I was left to pick up the pieces of my own shattered confidence. The next few days were a blur. I didn't know what to do or how to process the situation. I kept telling myself it wasn't that big of a deal. After all, I was just starting out. Maybe I didn't deserve the credit just yet. Maybe I was being too sensitive. But deep down, I knew what had happened. They had taken my ideas, my creativity, and turned them into something they could claim as their own. And no one, not the clients or the higher-ups at the agency, knew the truth. I wanted to confront them. I wanted to stand up for myself and demand the recognition I deserved. But fear held me back. Jeremy and Sarah were both so well respected in the company. They had the power. I was just a junior designer. Who would listen to me? Would they laugh it off? Would they fire me for speaking up? The uncertainty paralyzed me, and I chose to stay quiet. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a one-off incident. It was happening more and more. I would work on a campaign, put my heart and soul into it, and then when it came time to present the final product, Jeremy and Sarah would step in and take the credit. They were stealing my work and making it their own, and I was the one left in the background, unnoticed and unappreciated. It wasn't just the ideas they were stealing. It was my time, my effort, my identity as a designer. I had always been someone who preferred to work quietly, behind the scenes, but this was different. They weren't just taking credit for my ideas. They were erasing me from the process altogether. One afternoon, after yet another meeting where I had been sidelined, I made a decision. I couldn't let this go on any longer. I had to take control of the situation, and I couldn't wait for someone to give me permission. I had to make them see who I was, who I had become in this company. I couldn't be invisible anymore. I started documenting everything. Every email, every meeting where they took credit for my work, every project that had been presented as theirs. I began keeping a detailed record of my contributions, making sure I had concrete evidence that I was the one who had done the work. But that wasn't enough. I needed more. I needed them to feel what it was like to be disregarded, to be overlooked, to have your hard work stolen and turned into something that wasn't yours. I began laying the groundwork for what would come next, a quiet, calculated plan to take back what was mine. I didn't know exactly how it would unfold, but I knew that it was time for them to learn a lesson. They had stolen my ideas, my hard work, but they would not steal my dignity. And I wasn't going to let them get away with it any longer. After weeks of silently simmering with frustration, I had finally decided that the time for passivity was over. Jeremy and Sarah had taken my work, my ideas, and my contributions, and they had used them to propel themselves further up the ladder while I remained in the shadows. It was time to stop being the invisible designer in the room. I needed to take back control not just over my career, but over my own worth. The first step in my plan was simple. I needed to document everything. I had already started keeping a record of the meetings where my work was hijacked, the campaigns where my contributions were erased. But now, I started being more meticulous. Every design I submitted, every revision, every comment I made in a meeting, all of it went into a folder. I made sure to store emails, meeting notes, client feedback, anything that could prove I was the architect behind the campaigns that Jeremy and Sarah were proudly taking credit for. I knew that if I wanted to strike back, I had to be strategic. I couldn't be reckless. One misstep, and it would be over. I needed to play this like a chess game, with each move calculated and precise. So, over the next few weeks, I worked harder than ever, making sure I was still producing top-tier designs. But I wasn't just doing it for the clients or for Carver and Hill, I was doing it for me. Every time I created something brilliant, every time I poured my heart and soul into a project, I knew it would soon be turned into the very thing I would use to destroy them. The next phase of my plan was to start laying the groundwork for the revelation. I knew that if I exposed them too soon, it would be seen as bitterness or vindictiveness. I needed to wait for the right moment, a moment where everything would fall into place. I wasn't just going to take credit for my work back. I was going to make sure that Jeremy and Sarah would never be able to take my work again without consequences. I began positioning myself in meetings in a way that wouldn't make me seem like a threat. I started speaking up more, giving my thoughts on campaigns, sharing insights, and quietly inserting myself into the process. I didn't want to seem like a disgruntled employee. I wanted them to think I was just another team player, someone who was willing to collaborate and be part of the process. I made sure my contributions were visible, but I did it in a way that wouldn't attract too much attention. I wasn't looking to be the star, I was looking to set up a foundation of credibility that would give me the upper hand when the time came. At the same time, I was making sure to increase my network within the company. I made friends with a few people in HR, a couple of the senior designers, and even some of the account managers who had worked with me on projects. I wasn't doing it to gain favors. I was doing it to gather allies. I needed people who could vouch for my work, who could verify that I was the one who had been doing all the heavy lifting. The more people I had on my side, the more difficult it would be for Jeremy and Sarah to dismiss my claims when I eventually exposed them. Then, the perfect opportunity presented itself. We were working on a massive campaign for a luxury automobile brand, one of the biggest clients Carver and Hill had ever landed. The pressure was on, and the expectations were higher than ever. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I had already been doing the heavy lifting on the creative side of things, but I made sure that this time, I would leave no room for ambiguity. Every design, every layout, every element of the campaign would be a direct reflection of my vision. I wasn't going to leave anything to chance. When the first round of designs was presented, I held my breath. This was the moment where I would either fade into the background again, or I would finally be recognized for what I had done. As Jeremy and Sarah presented my work to the client, I watched them speak with such conviction, as if they were the ones who had designed everything. I watched as they took full ownership of the campaign, nodding and smiling as the client showered them with praise. But this time, it was different. This time, I wasn't going to let them get away with it. A few hours later, after the client had left, I made my move. I sat down with the head of the design team, Sarah, who had always appreciated my work but had never really known the full scope of what had been happening. We talked about the campaign, about how everything had gone, and I casually mentioned how happy I was that my work had been so well received. I told her in passing that I had actually been responsible for all the designs presented during the meeting. "Wait, what?" she asked, clearly taken aback. "You did all of that? I thought Jeremy was the one leading the creative on this project." I smiled, trying to keep it casual. "No, I was the one behind the designs. Jeremy just gave the presentation and spoke to the client about it. But yeah, all of it was mine." Sarah looked at me confused. "Why didn't you say anything? You should be getting credit for this." I just shrugged. "That's the way things go around here. You know how it is." That conversation was a game changer. I hadn't expected Sarah to be so receptive, but I could see the wheels turning in her head. She was already starting to see what had been happening, and she knew that the truth was buried beneath the surface. Over the next few days, I made sure that my design work was as visible as possible. I shared my progress in team meetings, showed off new ideas, and made sure the people around me knew exactly who was responsible for the creative direction of the project. But I didn't stop there. I began to build momentum in other departments as well. I reached out to some of the senior staff, discussing how my designs were affecting the brand's market performance. I asked for feedback, suggestions, and shared insights. I subtly reminded everyone in the office who was truly behind the successful elements of the campaign. By doing so, I made sure that my name was attached to the work, even if Jeremy and Sarah didn't want to acknowledge it. But what I was really doing was creating a network of people who could help me when the time came to expose the truth. I had laid the groundwork, and it was working. The tipping point came when I saw an email from Jeremy in my inbox, addressed to the rest of the team and the client. In it, he praised the creative direction of the campaign and thanked Sarah and himself for their hard work and leadership. Not a single mention of me. Despite the fact that my designs were at the heart of everything, I knew what I had to do. It was time to expose the truth. But I wasn't going to go in with guns blazing. I wasn't going to storm into a meeting and yell. That wouldn't accomplish anything. Instead, I decided to take a more calculated approach. I knew the company was all about reputation and perception, and if I could control that narrative, I would have the leverage I needed. I began drafting an email. The tone was professional, but clear. I made sure to lay out the facts, providing direct evidence of the work I had done. I included timestamps, designs, and email threads that showed I had been the one behind the ideas Jeremy and Sarah were claiming as their own. Before I sent it to anyone at Carver and Hill, I reached out to a few trusted people, those who had been working with me on the campaign, and those in higher ups in other departments. I asked them to verify my contributions. They all agreed, and within a few hours, I had the final push I needed. When I sent the email to HR and the agency's senior leadership, I included the full list of projects I had worked on, the dates of my submissions, and the evidence to back up every claim. The subject line was simple: attribution of work on recent campaigns. The email sent ripples through the agency. It didn't take long before Jeremy and Sarah were called into an emergency meeting with Our. They tried to downplay it, tried to deny everything, but the evidence was irrefutable. I watched from the sidelines, feeling a surge of satisfaction. It wasn't just about taking back what was mine. It wasn't about getting a pat on the back. It was about showing them that they couldn't get away with it, not without consequences. They had underestimated me, thought they could take my work and turn it into their own. But now, they had learned that you can take someone's ideas, but you can't take everything. The email had done its work. The ripple effect was immediate, but it wasn't without consequences. The truth was out, and the air around Carver and Hill shifted overnight. Jeremy and Sarah were blindsided. They were both summoned to HR the moment the email was received, and it didn't take long for the fallout to begin. The high-profile campaign they had taken credit for, now tarnished by the revelations of plagiarism and dishonesty. The emails, timestamps, and evidence of my work had left no room for denial. The truth hung in the air like a storm cloud, and it was only a matter of time before the company was forced to address it. The following days were a whirlwind. While the senior leadership at Carver and Hill tried to keep the situation under wraps, word quickly spread among the staff. Whispers echoed in the hallways, behind closed doors, in the break rooms. People were talking, gossiping, and for the first time in my career at the agency, I was no longer invisible. I was a figure of intrigue, a person people suddenly wanted to understand. Was I the villain for exposing this? Or was I the hero who had finally stood up for myself? But that wasn't the only thing weighing on me. I had accomplished what I set out to do. I had reclaimed what was mine. But now that I had the power, I had to decide what to do with it. What was my next move? I could have stayed silent, let things play out, maybe even faded back into the background. But the reality was that I wasn't the same person I had been just a few months ago. The quiet, compliant designer who let others take credit for her work was gone. In her place was someone who understood her worth and wasn't willing to be anyone's doormat. The day after the email had been sent, I found myself summoned to a meeting with HR and the senior leadership team. They had seen the evidence, heard the complaints, and were now seeking my side of the story. It wasn't entirely unexpected, but I was nervous nonetheless. This was the moment where everything could either fall apart or solidify my position. When I entered the meeting room, I saw Jeremy and Sarah seated across from me, their expressions dark and defeated. The confidence they once had was gone, replaced by a mix of anger, shame, and frustration. They were no longer the untouchable pair they had been before. Now, they were at my mercy. "We've gone over the materials," said Marissa, the head of HR, looking at me with a stern, professional expression. "And we've also reviewed the emails from both Jeremy and Sarah, as well as the design files in question. We'd like to hear from you directly about what happened." I sat down, maintaining eye contact with Marissa, but I couldn't help but notice the way Jeremy and Sarah were avoiding my gaze. The arrogance they had once projected had evaporated. For the first time, I saw them as they truly were: vulnerable, cornered, and without the power they had abused for so long. I did the work. It's as simple as that, I said, my voice steady, calm, but unwavering. The designs, the concepts, the campaigns, they were all mine. I put in the hours, the effort, and the creativity to make it happen. But instead of crediting me, they took it. And when I tried to point it out, I was ignored. Jeremy opened his mouth to speak, but Marissa raised a hand, signaling for him to stay quiet. Are you saying that you didn't contribute at all to the campaign? Marissa asked, glancing between the three of us. No, I replied. I'm saying I did everything, and yet, Jeremy and Sarah presented my work as their own to the client. They used my name as a mere afterthought. I was never mentioned, and that's a pattern. I've been sidelined for months while they took credit for my ideas. The room fell into a heavy silence. I didn't need to look at Jeremy and Sarah to know how this was affecting them. The weight of their actions was finally catching up with them. Claire, Marissa continued after a long pause, this is a serious matter. We understand the situation now, but we need to know how you'd like us to proceed. What do you want? I didn't hesitate. I had made up my mind weeks ago. I want recognition for my work, I said firmly. I want it in writing. I want the clients to know the truth, and I want it reflected in my career here. I'm done being ignored. If the company is serious about fixing this, then I expect compensation both financially and professionally for the work I've done. A week passed, and things at Carver and Hill were in chaos. Jeremy and Sarah were placed on probation, their actions under review. The higher-ups were scrambling to salvage the reputation of the agency. Clients were furious, and some had even threatened to pull out due to the breach of trust. But what struck me the most was how quickly the dynamics had shifted. Suddenly, people were paying attention to me. I was no longer a nameless designer. I was a force, a reminder of the power that lies within those who refuse to be overlooked. In the days that followed, I received an official apology from both Jeremy and Sarah. The email was cold, calculated, and devoid of sincerity, but it was an apology nonetheless. They had no choice but to admit their wrongdoing. I wasn't looking for their contrition, but it still felt satisfying to see them stumble, to watch as they were forced to acknowledge what they had done. But the most important result of all this came when I was offered a significant raise and a much more prominent role within the company. The higher-ups knew that I had been instrumental in Carver and Hill's success, even if they hadn't always recognized it. Now, they had no choice but to give me the position I deserved, despite the monetary compensation and the recognition. There was something hollow about it all. Yes, I had reclaimed my work. Yes, I had exposed the truth. But there was still something gnawing at me, something that didn't sit right. As Jeremy and Sarah began to step back from their roles, it became clear that I wasn't the only one who had been hurt by their actions. The ripple effect of their theft had tainted the agency's culture, and trust had been broken. And though I had taken back what was mine, there was a deep sense of sadness that lingered in the air. What had happened to Carver and Hill's creativity? To its integrity? How had a company that once valued collaboration become so corrupt? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my victory wasn't just about taking credit for my work. It was about setting boundaries, about showing myself and everyone else that I wasn't going to let anyone take what was rightfully mine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to be done, more people to be held accountable, more stories like mine that needed to be heard. It was around that time that I made a decision. I couldn't stay at Carver and Hill forever. I had reclaimed my worth within these walls, but I had outgrown them. The agency had failed me and countless others who were pushed aside for the sake of ambition and ego. They had used me to get ahead, but in the end, I was the one who walked away with everything. I began making plans to start my own design firm, one that valued creativity, transparency, and respect. I wasn't just going to be a designer who was taken advantage of anymore. I would build something where my ideas would be celebrated, where I would be treated as an equal, not as someone to steal from. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about control. It was about owning my future.